Welcome to VCR, a vintage cinema rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And Blake just spent 5 minutes explaining his opinions on glassware to me between episodes.
You know, surprisingly connected to Edward Scissorhands.
Kind of, yeah. No, I'm into it.
It has the same sort of mystique to me as the hedges do in this suburban hellscape that we find ourselves in Edward Scissorhands.
Suburban hellscape is a good way of putting it, actually. Yeah.
So we're talking about Edward Scissorhands. This is our deep dive episode. If you've never seen this movie, go back and check out the primer because we talk about who this is for and whether it holds up.
Go watch
fun
it.
Stuff, and where you can watch it. But this is the full deep dive spoiler episode, so let's go.
So, where should we jump in? Because I have opinions about this movie.
I don't know. We were kind of on the urban hellscape, like the aesthetic of the film. You want to start with that? I think that's a big piece of this movie.
I think so. A lot of the conflict and humor this movie comes from it's a very, very beige, very, very pastel colored suburban hellscape, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it seems very uniform. There's a great shot early on where all the husbands leave for work and you see all their cars pulling out at the same time.
They're all the same car.
Yeah. And then there's a lot of like, we meet all these kind of like gossipy housewives just kind of chilling. And then when Peg shows up with Edward, it's like the talk of the town, right? Like you see, it's like they're all playing phone tag. Like everyone's like, oh, who's this? Like what's going on, right? So, and again, a lot of the humor comes from it's this very uniform world where everyone is, forced to look and act exactly the same. And then we get Edward.
Yes.
A goth with scissors for hands.
Who comes from like this big gothic mansion on a hill. I just love that contrast of like this crazy suburban hellscape, and then we get like this weird gothic house on the hill.
Yeah, right? And I feel like every small town has like something like that where it's just like, oh, that's the creepy house. We don't go near, right?
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, what I found really interesting about this movie is how the community embraces Edward.
Right. I actually wrote that down as well as something that I wanted to talk about because I think that it's really interesting how it kind of all plays out with the larger community, right? Is because there's this initial embrace of, and I wrote it different, but what I meant was actually there's an embrace of exoticism in a sense.
Kind of, yeah. Like he becomes like a curiosity.
I feel like we go through that. Like there's different trends. Like there's kind of the I feel like in the 2010s era, there was like the Kardashian exoticism kind of era where it was like, oh, everybody should look kind of tan and have dark hair and like certain features kind of thing.
Right.
There's kind of like this thing where they're just like all attracted to him because he's different and he's new.
Oh, and what's her face is really attracted to him. More on that later.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, like they actually, Joyce, that's her name. But at the end of the day, they actually like don't understand or even care to really understand Edward.
Okay, let's say I'm a screenwriter in the 80s and Tim Burton commissions me to write this movie. What I would do is I would do this movie in reverse, where at first they're repulsed by him, but then he wins them over, right?
Right.
But this movie does, what I found actually so interesting and so noteworthy about this movie is that the community essentially rejects Edward.
Yeah.
And he rejects them back.
Right.
Actually, so the ending is it's Kim, who's now an old woman, telling her granddaughter about this man she used to know, and I was stunned that they didn't get together.
Mm-hmm.
And that Edward is essentially shunned back into his castle.
Right.
And I just kind of thought, that is not what I expected from this movie.
It feels like very original in a sense because like you said, it does kind of do a reversal. Like it starts with everybody embracing him and then they all kind of
turn on him because of a few situations that weren't even his fault.
Yeah. And then that's, again, coming back to like this community not really understanding him at all and not caring to understand. They just want him. I actually thought about this analogy, and it's kind of like when human beings take in a wild animal and then through no fault of the wild animal itself, like doing something horrible to the people that it's taken in. Like I think that the big one here is like that ape who like ripped off the lady's face years ago.
I remember that.
It's like, well, you were the one who took this wild animal in, and you didn't actually like care for the nature of this animal. Like, it's similar with Edward, because at the end of the day, the man has scissors for hands.
Scissors for hands.
Like, there's going to be accidents. He's going to accidentally scratch you, cut you. Like, he doesn't understand the human experience, right? Because he isn't even fully human.
Well, there's that great moment where at the end, Kim is an old woman and Edward has not aged a fucking day.
Right.
So he's also apparently immortal.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that that's kind of what I looked at it like as well. The other thing that I would compare this to pretty heavily is like Frankenstein. And
yeah, that was clearly a big influence for this story too,
right? Right. And the twist is that what if Frankenstein was initially accepted by the community and they actually turned against him over time, kind of thing, right?
There's this great quote by Terry Pratchett where he says, "The people who applaud at your coronation are the same people that cheer at your execution."
Right.
Because some people just want a good show, right?
Exactly.
So it really just shows how fickle the whims of people can be. I almost kind of feel like, I don't even know if I should say this, I almost kind of feel like this movie is almost like a case study on like cancel culture, you know, where it's just like, and by the way, I don't believe in cancel culture. I don't lean that way, but I just feel like, you know, when you talk about just how like at first one moment everyone loves you and then they all turn on you because of something that wasn't even your fault.
I mean, in some of those cases, in a lot of those cases, the fault can be laid blame on the people who are canceled. So.
Yeah, no, and I'm like, again, I'm not.
I don't know if I agree with the analogy. Is what I'm saying.
I'm not saying I believe in cancel culture. I'm just saying this is almost kind of. I can see how that some people might take that analogy from that. So okay, I'm just gonna launch into my interpretation of this movie.
Yeah, go
Keep
for
in
it.
mind, I'm very biased, so this is all filtered through my eyes and my personality. But
I think, and as a side note, before you get into this, I think that this is a movie that is going to be very personable to each and every person who watches it.
Yeah. So, and it's hard not to love Edward, right? Because he clearly is kind-hearted, not a mean bone in his body, very talented, but he just doesn't. I mean, look at him. How is he supposed to fit into this community, right?
And again, kudos to Johnny Depp. I think this is like a career performance.
One of his best performances for sure. I think it's funny. I think he took this movie because he was tired of being typecast as like a teen heartthrob. Mm-hmm. And then after this movie, he was typecast as a weird oddball. So, right? But I mean, hey, you know, I almost feel like this movie is like a metaphor for like the artist experience, right? You know, as an artist, I'm obviously, you know, a little biased here, but I just kind of feel like, you know, he's taken into this community and he has a really hard time fitting in, right? Like just both physically, emotionally, and mentally. You know what I mean? Like he's clearly very uncomfortable in his own skin. He has a really hard time relating to people. Very quiet, very different. But like you put him in front of like a topiary and boom, he's super duper talented, right?
Right.
So that becomes his way of connecting with people, is this art that he can do. But then he still has a really hard time navigating this world and fitting in with these people, right?
It's almost a movie about, sorry, I'm kind of commandeering this slightly.
No, go for it.
But it's almost a movie about autism in a sense as well.
Kind of, yeah. Like he clearly just doesn't, you know, and there's all this stuff where they're like trying to get him to fit in and do things, and he's not equipped to do it, right? Like physically and mentally, but like he clearly wants to fit in and please people, but he can't, right? He's just kind of hapless and awkward through no fault of his own. And then like despite that though, the community doesn't understand him. They turn on him. He's clearly never really going to fit into this suburban world. So in the end, he just kind of retreats, and when we last see him, he's just alone in his castle just doing his art, right?
Right.
But then he's still making it snow unto the community. So it's almost like he's providing value to the community, but he's not able to be a part of it. And I feel like, and again, I'm obviously projecting a lot of my own shit onto this movie, but I almost kind of feel like that's the artist experience.
Honestly, I think Tim Burton would probably agree with you in a lot of that sense as well. Like, I really see where you're coming from.
Yeah, like, again, it's like through my art, I can provide value to this community, but just because of who I am and how my brain works, I'll never really be part of this community.
Yeah, and I think that that's a very sad thought and a very sad experience, but I think that that's also how this movie ends. It ends on a very sad note, in my opinion.
Well, it's the story of the misfit, right? The
Right.
guy who, he's obviously intelligent and hyper talented, but he's the misfit. He's the ultimate square peg in a world of round holes.
Yes.
There's that great moment when he kind of finally loses his shit and he storms off down the road, and he's, they kind of stuffed him into this like suburban outfit with like khakis and a dress shirt,
Yep.
and he just like rips it all off.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah.
This is who I am.
Right. There's something weirdly, as sad as it is, there's something weirdly triumphant about that moment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that it's also very cynical about humanity as well. And I think that also kind of adds to maybe some of the deep sadness that I had watching the end of this. Like, for me personally, that was my read on it, is that this is a film that is deeply cynical about the human experience and what we do as a community to people who maybe don't quite fit in.
I guess so, right? And again, I'm projecting a lot here, but like, I've often, especially like I feel like teenage me would have really related to Edward, just the awkwardness, not fitting in, super uncomfortable in your own skin,
Yep.
right? And then, even now at like 32, I'm still kind of just like, I feel like I'm still constantly like ripping off articles of clothing that don't belong on my body. I'm naked right now while we're recording this, but no, but
there's almost something, like you said, there's almost something triumphant in that, in a sense as well, though, right? Like,
yeah, I feel like throughout most of my 20s and even now into my 30s, I'm kind of on this own journey where it's like, no, I'm fucking weird and I'm gonna own it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, fuck, yeah, like.
I'm kind of like in real time processing this.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, like I guess there is more triumph in the end than I initially was thinking about, because in the end, Edward does get to be the person that he wants to be.
But sorry, I'm commandeering it now.
Yeah.
He gets to be the person he wants to be, but he can only be that person in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something kind of, I don't know. Do you think Edward is happy at the end when we last see him?
I don't know.
He seems okay. I mean,
Yeah.
he's just wandering around his garden, just snipping at his topiary, but I don't know. It looks kind of lonely, doesn't it?
Another movie that I watched this year that I didn't connect with as much, but I think is objectively a pretty good movie, is I Saw the TV Glow, which is about, I think it's more about the trans experience and kind of navigating that.
Is that the one with Will Ferrell?
No.
Okay.
That's Will and Harper. No, very, very, very different movies. But it was a movie that I didn't quite connect with, just because like I haven't personally had that experience myself, but it's a movie that I appreciated, and I'm glad that it exists and is out there as well for those people who also kind of have to experience that life, and all of the, like, sadness and the way that human beings, like in our culture, kind of treat that.
Yeah, I guess so, right? And it's a weird experience.
Yeah. We're all a bunch of weirdos, right? Like, at the end of the day, we're all a bunch of individual weirdos that are just trying to like live our lives.
I guess it's just like everybody's weird, but like some people are just not as capable of hiding it.
Yeah.
So
there was a little bit of catharsis for me in the end, and this is probably not something that Tim Burton was planning, but I like that when Kim finishes retelling her story at the end, there's almost kind of a Jack and Rose kind of end of the conclusion of the story of like, I shared this special time with this person, he lives on in my memory, I'm passing the story on, and this is my resolution.
Right.
And it doesn't obviously meet the same level of like catharsis as Titanic does. Like, they're going for very different things there, but I saw a little bit of that in this as well. I really struggle with this ending a lot because on one hand, I wish that there was a happy ending, a more happy ending for Edward.
For these two characters, it is kind of funny. Even the granddaughter's like, why don't you go see him? And she's like, no, I'm an old woman. Like, I prefer he remember me as I was.
Right.
And I'm a little like, you're not fucking dead.
Yeah.
Like,
it's sad as well, right?
Yeah. You're just old. Do you mean your knees can't take the trip up the hill? Like,
I don't know. I think it's like this memory that you have, right? Like, if, for example, if somebody in your family passes away and you have to watch them deteriorate, right?
Yeah.
Do you really want to remember them during the time of deterioration, or do you want to remember them for all the good memories that you had of them?
I guess so, right?
So that's kind of what I guess I read into that. I didn't necessarily love this ending, and that's because I think that you're not supposed to. I think that this movie is, deeply personal, and I think that
Bittersweet, maybe?
it's bittersweet, and it's clearly going for that, and I'm so happy that Tim Burton got the ending that he wanted to this one. I'll say that this is one of the endings that I've thought about the longest and the hardest in a long time.
Yeah.
To a movie. I don't know. It's kind of a masterpiece in its own way.
Kind of, yeah. I particularly liked when the bully, the guy, when he finally gets his comeuppance and gets hoisted out a window.
I have mixed feelings about that. I don't know if I don't know if that went too far. If that got a little too wild.
I guess the argument is because he murdered someone, he now has to hide in the castle for the rest of his life.
Right.
Because, she went off and said that, like, he died. I do find it kind of funny that she's like, a bit of plaster fell on him and he died too. Here's his glove. And I'm like, does nobody want to check?
I know, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe he's just unconscious, or like, are we just going to let the body sit there?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it's fairy tale logic, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
It's kind of funny. There is the really cool cop in the movie who seems like the only reasonable person in town. But even he's just like, all right, screw it. Like,
yeah, what a compassionate cop. He's just like, Edward wasn't made for this world, and we're not going to prosecute him because, like, how can you prosecute somebody who just doesn't know how to actually, like, manage in this world?
Yeah, and even has kind of this moment where he's just like, he's talking to Edward and he's like, man, like, or he's talking to Peg and he's like, I'm going to be up all night worrying about this kid.
Yeah.
I'm like, aw.
Yeah.
Nice.
It's very sweet. I was surprised by how wholesome the first half of this movie is. Yes, Joyce is, like, crazy horny. But
so there is that awkward moment, too, we should talk about at some point, where she tries to seduce him and he clearly doesn't know what's going on.
Right. It's strangely wholesome that, Peg, this Avon saleswoman, picks this poor Bambi up and tries to, like, nurse him back to health and bring him into her home. And
they're also
community.
Like, to continue the metaphor of, like, the artists, like, they are so supportive.
Yeah.
Right? They recognize he's talented and they really, like, give him a lot of opportunities. Like, they even try to help him get a loan.
Yeah.
Although it is so funny, the scene with the loan where the bank officer's just like, okay, you have no credit, no social insurance, no social insurance number. You don't even have, like, you have no record of employment. And then there's, like, a big bank vault behind them that's closing while they're talking. Yeah. And he basically just tells Edward, he's like, just buy a car and, like, start making monthly payments. Then we'll talk.
I love how that's just, like, reality just creeps in that moment, right?
Yeah. And again, talking to the whole artist experience, like, I think part of the reason I've been able to flourish is because my family was very supportive. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's cool.
I like how the movie also focuses in on Edward's perspective of all of this. And there's even some, like, POV shots of Edward, like, eating dinner, for example, and stuff like that. Like, this is a movie so focused on his experience, and I think that is the focus, and I think that's why your analogy to
the artist
and also that's what I think this movie is also the main focus is on, right? It's like this outcast and the struggle of being different, and in a world that wants you to be conform,
in a world that wants you to, like, follow marching orders. Yeah.
So, I don't know, I really appreciate a lot of that. What blew my mind is in the opening, like, the Avon, like, how focused this movie was on Avon saleswoman at first, like, and I actually did a lot of research into that because I was like, I can't believe this movie is focusing on and making a hero out of a pyramid scheme saleswoman.
Is that a real thing, Avon?
Yes, it is.
Oh, gross.
So I did a bunch of research into this because I was like, I can't believe that this is how we're focusing on this movie, and, like, this hasn't aged well, and I still stand by that hasn't necessarily aged well, but that's because of how contemporary, how this has kind of played out, like, with the pyramid schemes, because back in the 60s, like, this was an acceptable business. Like, back in the 60s, as a woman, you weren't, like, most women weren't in the workforce in, like, meaningful numbers yet, so instead of going to drive to the office, go to work kind of thing, most women didn't even have access to a car in the 60s.
Fuck.
So if you didn't have access to a car, what you would do then is you would do something like this, which was actually seen in a positive light, go door to door to sell these Avon beauty products to other women who also were stay-at-home moms and
I
stay-at-home
guess.
wives. So the pyramid scheme part of Avon and like the pyramid schemes that we know today, they all flourished in like the 2000s actually, and that's when Avon changed their business model into like being more of a pyramid scheme. So that's actually more the movie not aging well because of what's happened with these products.
See, I just assumed that was like a fictional company that they just made up.
No.
Wow, okay. Interesting. Because they would have had to get permission from Avon to put them in the movie.
Likely, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder how they pitched that.
But I mean, it's not even seen in a negative light because at that time, it still hadn't kind of changed to that negative.
It still hadn't gone on its villain arc or whatever the saying is.
Exactly. So
interesting.
Yeah.
I will say I do have a slight critique of this movie in that, you know, for the first maybe 45, 50 minutes, it almost felt like a series of like vignettes or sketches where it's just Edward clumsily trying to fit in. You know, for me, and this is kind of my own neuroses as a writer, I'm just like, where's the tension? Where's the tension? Where's the tension?
Mm-hmm.
And I was surprised in that, like, there didn't seem to be much tension because everybody seemed to just like Edward.
Right.
And then when it turned and they all suddenly turned on him, like, oh, here's the tension, right? So I do think the movie drags a wee bit in the first half when everybody likes Edward. You know what I mean? And maybe that just shows what a miserable bitch I am as a writer, where I'm just like, no, everyone's getting along too much. This movie's dragging.
I think that's actually really masterful. And I think that that speaks to Tim Burton's unique way of approaching a story.
Yeah. It almost, and I've said this before, it's almost kind of like the movie is told backwards.
Right.
If there wasn't that turn, I would have not been as well disposed towards the movie. When the turn happened, I was like, all right, you got me. Like, let's keep going.
I think that it's very well written, and I think, you're right. There's kind of a vignette take to it where it's like, oh, Edward's doing this kooky thing. Like, what kooky thing is he going to do next kind of thing,
Well,
right?
and, you know, to walk back my point a little, or to give the movie some credit, you know, there is a lot of comedy to be mined from this weirdo trying to fit into suburbia.
Yeah. The other part of this movie that I find fascinating is how it views these women in the 60s who are the stay-at-home wives and mothers, right?
Yeah.
I think that it's hard for us to conceptualize this time because our world is so different now. But, you know, like that was basically like maybe not necessarily our grandparents, but our great-grandparents living this life, or maybe our grandparents in a way. It's just, it's so wild seeing them, you know, stuck at home, all of the gossip that comes from that, of being so mindlessly bored.
Yeah, like Edward showing up is the most exciting thing that has ever happened to them.
Yeah. And, you know, they all kind of swoon over him. Everybody's so excited. And, you know, they're the ones who turn hardest on him, right?
Yeah. I mean, is that a little misogynistic maybe? Or is it just the movie?
I don't know. And I think that's tough to say for us who haven't experienced this world. And what I mean is the 60s.
The 60s. Yeah, we were born much later.
Oh, surprisingly less later than you might think, though.
Yeah, I know, right?
The 60s are closer to our birth year than we are to our birth year right now.
Shut up, Blake. It's funny, I was telling a story about how I went on a date with someone I went to high school with, and one of my friends was like, oh, what was that, like 30 years ago? I was like,
yep.
No, 14.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. I don't know. There really is something to be said, like, socially about this movie. Should we maybe talk about the jock boyfriend? What's his face?
Yeah, for sure.
Blondie.
Yeah, Jim, which is like the ultimate evil white man's name.
Have you ever met a nice Jim? Anyone? I didn't think so. So I do love that, though. It's like, we need a villain for this movie. Let's call him Jim.
You got Big Jim Rennie in Stephen King's Under the Dome.
That's
one of
true.
the great villains.
That's true. Okay, so there's something there. What a prick.
Yeah.
What a total prick.
One note, evil bastard.
One note, evil bastard, right? Yeah. He's clearly threatened by Edward because he can tell that Kim is a little intrigued by him.
Well, and Kim's kind of like the typical cheerleader girlfriend, right? Like where she's actually probably smarter than she lets on, but society tells her that because of her beauty, she should be with this jock.
Jim.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? I will say, switching gears a bit, I do totally believe that Kim would fall for Edward and vice versa.
Yep.
You see it sometimes in real life, right? Like, sometimes unconventional looking people who are just kooky and weird, there's something weirdly magnetic and charismatic about them because they're just so different.
Yep.
And he's so, sweet. Like, he ends up implicating himself in this stupid robbery just because, Jim lies to Edward and says, these people stole from me. And Edward's response is like, well, just tell their parents and they'll make them give it back.
Yeah.
But then later on, he admits, he's like, I knew it was Jim's house.
Yep.
And she's like, well, why'd you do it? He's like, you asked me to.
Yeah.
I do like that, I do kind of think it's funny that, normally you try to give your villains, some nuance, maybe even some redeeming qualities, and they just went, no, fuck it, he's the villain.
Well, yeah, and in a way, this is kind of a revenge story, right? Like, this is Tim Burton's revenge story against the people that he would not have been friends with in high school, right?
Yeah, and that's putting it mildly. This is him flipping the bird to every jock who bullied him in high school.
It's on the same level of some of Quentin Tarantino's revisionist history, right?
Yeah, no. I made a joke once where it's like, be nice to the nerds in high school because one day they'll be checking your prostate and doing your taxes. Or in this case, they're going to make you a villain in a movie.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to talk about Bill a little bit because I love Bill's portrayal as this. He's kind of like this absent-minded dad who his heart's in the right place, but he just he's so out of place in every situation that he's in. Essentially,
he's a little did he seem like a good dad or just kind of a shitty one?
He seems like a dad.
Yeah, just dad. Period.
Yes, I love the portrayal. He's just always kind of. The closest we get to the interior of Bill is when him and Edward have drinks together in the basement. And you just see
he's venting about how much he doesn't understand his teenage daughter.
Yeah,
he's
and how
they get these glands.
Yeah, he's thinking back to he's having nostalgia in that moment back to when she was a kid, right? And he could connect with her at that point.
I will say, I've often thought that when I have kids, I'm really going to enjoy them when they're young and when they're adults. But the teen years are going to drive me up the fucking wall.
Yeah, for sure. And it's exactly the same in this regard as well, right? Where Bill just kind of shuts down in a way. He just kind of he has dad blinders on.
Dad blinders is a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
It's even kind of funny. So they're throwing this Christmas party later and nobody's showing up because they've all been shunned.
Yeah.
He sees Edward kind of storming off and he seems a little dismissive of it. He's like, I just saw him walking down the road.
Yeah.
He's like, whatever, I'll go look for him. And then he comes home. Couldn't find him, and then Peg's like, well, let's get in the car and find him.
Right.
And Kim's like, I'm coming too. He's like, no, you're staying here.
And I love how his reaction, when after Joyce tries to, I don't even know what the way to put it is, put the moves on Edward down in the hairdressing studio.
In the storeroom, yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, can I just say that, it's so funny when Edward kind of runs off. She's like, Edward, you can't do this to me. And I want to say, what? Refuse consent?
I will say that's maybe one of my favorite moments in the entire movie is when Edward goes, and then she showed me the back room where she took all her clothes off, because every reaction at that table is exactly the reaction of each one of those characters to a T.
Yeah, right.
You've got Kevin the kid who's just giggling there. You've got the mother, which is just mortified.
Yeah.
Kim has no idea how to react, and the father just presses on with what he said.
It's just moving on.
doesn't even acknowledge what Edward just said. He's got the dad blinders on so hard in this moment.
Can I just say that as a professor, sometimes students will say the most out of pocket things and you just have to be like, all right, never mind. I am not unpacking that.
Yeah, I can see that. I love Bill in this movie. He's so good. Alan Arkin is fantastic.
You do get the sense that maybe he doesn't quite have the emotional availability, and I mean that's probably fairly typical for a dad of this generation, but you can tell he does care about Edward.
Oh yeah,
he wants him to do well, and he's when he gets caught stealing, he's upset obviously, but he's not he's not coming down on him too hard.
They're almost upset with themselves, aren't they?
Kind of. Yeah, I think Peg is more upset with herself, and He's just more like, there's that funny scene where he's like pitching these like scenarios to him and asking him what he
Right.
would do, right?
Yeah.
He's almost just like, I'm going to teach you ethics at the dinner table.
And his ethics are like silly and archaic.
Yeah, well, it's like you find a briefcase full of money at the side of the road. What do? Do you like give it to your friends and family? Do you keep it for yourself, or do you turn it into the police?
Right.
And then Edward's like, give it to my friends and family. And then Kevin's like, no, you dope. Everyone knows you take it to the police. I will say one of the funniest short scenes is when Kevin brings Edward in for show and
Oh
tell.
my God. I wrote that down. We had to talk about that. It's so hilarious.
Yeah.
Because early in the movie, like, Kevin's like, I want to bring him to show and tell. And everyone's like, you are not going to bring him to show and tell.
Right.
And then he does anyway.
And he's just like, and he can cut your throat with a single slash. And then Edward slashes and all the kids recoil.
Yeah, it's great. I love that scene. That might be my scene in the movie.
Kevin is probably like the least developed character, obviously, but he has some solid bangers.
Yeah, he's the comedic foil of the movie, I guess.
Kind of. I do love that scene where like Peg forces Kim to sleep in his room and he's up on the top bunk and his arm is just dangling off the side of the bed.
Right.
And Kim like moves the arm up, but then he rolls over and it falls over. Like the arm slides over again and she's just like, ugh. Yeah.
I think there's no other movie that uses or utilizes waterbeds the same way that this movie does. I laughed very hard the first time Edward accidentally pokes the hole in the waterbed. He just like covers it up with the toy.
Yeah, it's just like, that didn't happen. And then of course when Kim comes home and he just like
yeah. That is a really great scene.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. Again, the direction, and Johnny Depp really fully embodies this character.
Yeah, I very much agree. And actually on that note as well, we're kind of, I think, starting to wrap up this part. There's some really interesting like casting choices that were made for this. Like Johnny Depp's obviously was the right person for this role, but Tom Hanks was considered, Tom Cruise was considered.
No.
Tom Cruise is a wild thought for this one. The studio wanted him for it, and Tom Cruise was basically just like, he came and he actually like discussed with Tim Burton, and he was just like, well, I don't understand the character. Like, how does he go to the washroom? How does he do this? How does he do that? And Tim Burton was like, you're not the right person.
Yeah,
for this.
no, you
like,
can't.
this is not what this movie is.
You can't
about.
match my freak.
There are movies that are like want to get into the minute details of how something works and like how this mechanisms of this universe work, and this is not that movie at all, right?
No, right?
So
no, it's got that like fairy tale logic, right?
Yeah.
Does Edward even need to eat?
I don't think he does necessarily.
I feel like he's just eating to be polite.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Oh, before we wrap up this part, I want to talk about Vincent Price as the inventor. I think that's like, that was the scene, one of the two scenes that stuck with me the most from my childhood, is that and Edward like cutting all of the topiaries.
Yeah.
Those are both very memorable. Like, I guess I love the Rube Goldberg kind of ideas. Like, I love that kind of factory like setup that he's got in there.
Well, there's that really interesting flashback that Edward's not even in, where you see him making these cookies and some of them are heart-shaped, and he just kind of casually picks one up and like holds it over like one of his machines, and that seems to be him getting the idea like, oh, I should bring one of these to life.
I think that that's the contrast to something like Frankenstein and this movie, and that's what makes this more original, right? And keeps it like fresh, is this Frankenstein monster is made out of love and loneliness rather than, can we do this?
Can we? Yeah, I mean, Victor Frankenstein was a total prick.
Yeah.
But anyways, it is kind of funny though. Then there's that other flashback scene where he's reading about decorum to him.
Yeah.
And he kind of just says like, yeah, this is boring. Let's read poetry instead. But then it's so funny. I was looking at Edward in that, or he's like, it's funny, Edward. You can smile. And he's like,
yeah,
like,
right.
And like, obviously this doesn't deflate the movie or anything, but I was watching that scene. I'm like, why did you give him scissors for hands?
Well, it kind of explains it in a way, because like he's created by that robot that he puts the heart over, right? And that's the robot that cuts all of the cookies or whatever in the production line. So he's just like, just putting on human designs over this
human
robot.
Appendages and glands, I guess. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. That is kind of funny. And then it's kind of heartbreaking though when he's like, look, I got you hands.
Yeah.
And then he immediately drops dead of a heart attack.
That scene is even more heartbreaking when you know some of the backstory to it, because Vincent Price is obviously like very old at this point. Like, he was almost 80 years old, And
He looked good.
he did.
For like a sickly 80-year-old, he looked pretty good.
Yeah, and this is one of his last roles, and I'm sure on set with any like old actor who has to portray dying, essentially, like that can be probably hard on the casting crew, especially for someone as famous as Vincent Price.
Yeah.
But what makes it even more poignant is when he passes out, like he actually passed out in real life due to the heat and everything, and so like that's the honest, like him passing out, and then the reactions of that are all genuine.
Mm-hmm. Did he die during production or after the movie came
No,
out?
it was like 2-3 years after, but he didn't do anything really much after this.
Oh, okay.
So that's hard. I'm sure that's, if you're Tim Burton and you get Vincent Price because you loved him as a child and you have to like put him through that, I don't know. It's got to be hard, right?
I do find it a little bitterly amusing that like the shot of him falling over was the shot of him actually passing out. So
Yeah.
as heartbreaking as that was, Tim Burton was still like, I'm using that. Like, that's making it into the movie.
Yeah. Sequels, prequels, and reboots. So this does have a comic book series that kind of is a sequel that was released in 2014 and 2015. So if you absolutely need more than this, however, Tim Burton has said that like this movie, to keep it as original and wholesome and to keep the structure of it, to keep the beauty of this movie, he would never ever make a sequel of this.
Good for him.
Yeah.
I hope he sticks to that.
I really hope he does as well, because I think that this is such a perfect single story. Like
One and done.
contained. Yeah.
I mean, how would you even make a sequel to this, right?
Well, it would be tough, and it would undo the end. But I mean, we've seen plenty of other movies undo their ending, their beautiful ending, to ruin it with some other
To ruin
sequel.
it, yeah. I
So,
get that.
But like at the end of the day, even though that there's no direct sequel to this, like the DNA of this movie is so strong in the rest of Tim Burton's works, right?
Yeah, he never really recovered from this movie.
How could you though?
No, how could you?
Speaking to it, like getting into effects and filming, like this is so personal to him. Like he drew the idea of Edward Scissorhands when he was a teenager, like, and it was, this character was him and it was about his isolation and how he just like couldn't communicate people. He grew up in suburban Burbank, like in California.
Oh, fuck.
So
say no more.
yeah, so I mean, all of this is just like deeply, deeply personal to him. Like he said that he didn't have a lot of friends and he couldn't retain his friendships as a kid, and he like could never figure out why. And so even like the writer of this, like he commissioned Caroline Thompson to write this, and Caroline Thompson essentially said that like she wrote this out of love for Tim Burton. Like it's kind of like a very passionate like writing, because she called Tim Burton the most articulate person that she knew, but couldn't put a single sentence together.
Wow, shit.
So I love how deeply personal this movie is.
Yeah, I get that. And you see that with Edward too, in that he has like 10 lines in the whole movie.
Mm-hmm. I also love how Caroline also kind of intertwined like some of her own personal experience into this. Like, so she based the character of Peg off of her own mom, who apparently like back in the 60s used to bring strangers back to her home for like temporary to live with them.
Simpler time.
Yeah. And then the neighbors were based on like the neighbors that she had growing up.
Oh, fuck. That's hilarious.
Yeah. And so we talked about like obviously Frankenstein being a big influence of this. The one that I was going to bring up and I didn't get to was King Kong, is also pretty obviously like I see, especially like the final act of the film.
I guess so, actually. I could see that.
You brought up fairy tales and how that's directly related to a bunch of fairy tales, but there are a few other movies that this movie is directly inspired by, and that's Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a movie that you love, the Disney version, right?
I sure do. I rewatched it this year.
Phantom of the Opera and The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I really want to watch The Creature from the Black Lagoon. We should do that next year.
Like the OG one?
Yeah, the 1954 version.
Yeah.
I would really like to watch that.
I would like to watch In the Shape of Water too. Although I don't know if I can handle watching.
I like Guillermo del Toro, but I don't always like his movies.
Yeah, that's fair.
So he might be he's definitely in the same vein of Tim Burton, right?
Letting their freak flags fly.
Yeah, exactly. So Johnny Depp got this role, and he watched a bunch of Charlie Chaplin movies to kind of figure out how to create sympathy without any dialogue.
I could see that, actually. As someone who's watched a lot of OG Charlie Chaplin shit, like, yeah, I can see that.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't watched a lot of his stuff, so I've watched like clips, and that's really it.
We should do Charlie Chaplin at some point.
Definitely. Maybe next year.
Yeah, maybe next year.
We'll add that to the list.
Sound off in the comments if you want us to do Charlie Chaplin.
And which one do you want us to do?
I'd have to go back and think about it.
I feel like it's going to be like something like City Lights or something like that.
Probably something. I don't think I've even seen City Lights.
Or The Great Dictator.
That one's okay.
Yeah?
We should do his like tramp ones.
That might be City Lights then.
Yeah, that might be. Unless we want to go way back to like the 20s.
We'll just pick something famous like City Lights maybe.
Let's do that.
So they filmed this like actually in Florida, I think in Tampa Bay. These homes all actually existed. They're probably from the 60s period. The only
Probably.
thing they changed about them was they actually like painted the exteriors to make them look like even more garish is the word that they used.
Garish is a good word for it.
And they actually made the window sizes smaller in all the homes to make it more paranoid.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That's really funny. Imagine being a construction worker for a film company where you've got Tim Burton in all black with his frizzy hair just being like, paint them these colors and make the windows smaller. And you're just like, okay, Tim.
Yeah. And like I said before, like this is meant to be, the movie's meant to be seen through Edward's point of view, so that's why everything looks so fantastical. Like everything pops on the screen because of how he would actually picture all of this. It's like so new and fresh to him. And Edward only said 169 words in the whole movie.
Wow, that's more than I even thought.
It's funny because this kind of goes on the great list of like protagonists with the fewest amount of words, like John Wick 4, like there's a few other movies in that sense. Sisu has literally one word or maybe one sentence at the end of the movie.
That's true. He does.
So
good movie.
Great movie. I guess your protagonist can talk as little as you'd like. It's like the Legend of Zelda approach, right?
It's funny. The project I'm working on right now, I have a character who talks a lot, and then I have a character who says almost nothing.
Nice.
And it's an interesting trying to like make that work.
Yeah, for sure. There was one thing I was going to bring up in front of the camera section at the beginning was how religion plays a role in this movie as well.
Actually, I felt like it was kind of, so we meet this character who's always like, oh, I see Satan in Edward, and she's like a real Helen Lovejoy type,
right.
But she's barely in the movie.
Yeah.
When she first showed up, I'm like, oh, that's the villain. And then she just circles back a couple times and that's it.
Because everybody kind of dismisses her, which is, I think that's something that's common in 60s movies. Like I recently rewatched 12 Angry Men, which is another good example of this, where there's a point in time when a character has like a really racist tirade and everyone just turns their back to him, like literally turns their back to him. And it's like this really big triumphant moment, but it feels too naive or something. Like,
yeah,
that this character, and maybe it's just because of like how social media and how media has changed in the 21st century that like these people would have been kind of shunned and turn their backs to because, you know,
flip them the bird.
Yeah, but like now these people who are given a voice and who are able to connect easier with like-minded people and create like these communities of hatred.
The Andrew Tate effect, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
What a prick. Hey, Andrew Tate, if you're listening, go fuck yourself.
But yeah, no, like, you know what I mean though, right? Like this character is almost shunned to the background, and then it's not actually, I think that this is something I wanted to bring up. It's not actually her character who eventually is able to turn everybody against Edward, but religion definitely like amplifies everybody's
feelings on the matter.
Yeah, right? Like it's not, I think that the religion and the spiritualism of it all isn't like necessarily what is the cause of everybody's hatred towards Edward and how things turn on him, but it definitely helps to amplify it.
It's almost kind of like she's just kind of waiting to fan the flames.
Right, exactly.
It's almost like the flames get sparked, but she's there to like blow on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know. I think that's just a statement that Tim Burton was making there, and I really appreciate it in the movie.
Does religion factor into a lot of Tim Burton movies?
I don't know that it does, but I liked how it was portrayed in this movie, because it's not like, well, religion's the big bad here and we have to like fight against religion, but it's more so like everybody turns on him, and then there's this woman who's like, well, why don't we just use religion to actually
justify our hatred?
Yeah, to justify our hatred of him.
It is kind of funny how he gets his revenge on her, though. He like fucks with her topiary to make it look like the devil.
Yeah, it's great.
Edward has a slightly petty side, and I kind of love that for him.
I agree.
Yeah,
I very much agree.
A little bit of pettiness could give you character.
Yeah. So the score of the movie, scored by Danny Elfman, one of the greats. He does score a lot of Tim Burton's movies. This is truly magical. I don't know if you noticed it, but like I thought this was one of the best scores that I've listened to this year.
It was whimsical for sure. It certainly wasn't as good as yodeling, but you know.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Oh,
Somebody take the score from Raising Arizona and splice it into this movie because I want to see it.
Yeah.
I will pay you money. Not a lot of money, but I will pay you money for it.
Oh, that's great. But no, I genuinely like it's been stuck in my head. Like it's so magical. It's so good. Like I can't believe that Danny Elfman wasn't even nominated for Best Original Score for this. Like that I think is just absolutely absurd.
A travesty, you might say.
I very much think so. Like it's one of the best scores I've heard this year. It's one of my favorites now of all time.
Yeah, I don't know that I was as into it as you were, but that's more my own ear blindness.
Right. So look back at the times. So Winona Ryder, I said I was going to bring this up in the primer episode. She actually really struggled with this role because she obviously like she put on a wig, but she put on a persona that is very in contrast to who she is as a person. Like she was very much like a goth kind of girl in high school. Like she said she was bullied. Like she really connected more with like Edward than she would have with Kim.
So it would have been an interesting challenge for her. Yeah.
Yeah. And like she actually it upset her to have to play this role. Like it's something that like she really genuinely struggled with because she said there was one time even when in high school she got beat up in the washroom.
Wow.
And she said that there was actually like years after that, like after these movies and everything, she was at a coffee shop like in her local town or wherever she grew up, and she ran into like one of the people who beat her up, and the girl was like, "Oh, Winona, like can I get your autograph and everything?" And she basically was just like, "Well, do you remember me? Like, do you remember our relationship and like when back in high school and everything?" And she told her to go fuck herself after that. So I think that she finally got like the last laugh in that. This is me like even more so loving Winona Ryder here for this story.
Good for her. I mean, imagine bullying Winona Ryder.
Right.
Come on.
But I believe it though. Like I think she was definitely more like, like that gothic kind of girl. Like she just always has given me that vibe of like,
oh, don't we all have fantasies about running into a high school bully and telling them to fuck right off?
Yeah.
I was never bullied severely.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, we all had our things that happened to us. But
we all took a couple punches here and there.
Yeah, but not to the extent of like an Edward Scissorhands or something like that, right?
No, I almost wish I'd been bullied worse in high school so that now in my 30s I could have the satisfaction of being like, fuck you.
I think it's a different time too, right? Like I think that these movies, there was like extreme bullying in. Like I think the 80s and 90s were definitely a time where movies, had these kind of extreme bullies. And I think that speaks to more of like the people who were born in like the 50s and the 40s and 50s kind of thing, right? And like that time period was more susceptible to that. And like, and I think it's also like these people who were probably out of place and like, not the jocks in their era.
I remember, sorry to cut you off. I had a man bun for a while back when I had long hair. Let me rephrase, back when I had hair. And I remember my uncle, he was kind of razzing me about it. And he just said, when I was a kid, if you walked down the street with a hairstyle like that, a whole truckload full of dudes would have pulled up and beat the shit out of you.
Right.
And I looked at him and I was like, he's probably right.
Yeah.
But
that doesn't make it right. Like,
I know. It's awful. But I was just looking at him and I was like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah. But that just kind of speaks to like different times and things have gotten maybe better in a sense, but also kids can still be mean.
You know what's funny? And I don't care if you keep this in or not. I remember hanging out in the hallway once with my nerdy friends, and the football team was marching down the halls on their way out. And this one guy, let's call him Greg, looked at us, and he just went, "Look at these F slur."
Yeah.
F slur.
Yeah.
But what's funny is that nobody joined in.
Right.
Like, nobody said anything. Everybody just ignored him.
Yeah.
And then they all just walked away, and I just looked at my friends. I'm like, I guess we're F slurs. Like, but it was funny because I think he wanted to like rally the football team against us, but nobody cared.
Yeah.
But then I ran into Greg a few times after the fact, and he's actually a really nice guy. So I was like, all right.
You didn't get your go fuck off moment?
No, I was just like, hey, Greg.
Yeah. So
you know what? Actually, if I told him he said that to me, he'd probably be mortified. So I was like, whatever.
Yeah, fair enough. So, legacy of this movie, it did get nominated for one Oscar for Best Makeup, which obviously very much deserved. I don't know what beat it. I should have checked that out, but both Tom Burton,
Tom Burton, Tim Burton's lesser known brother, Tom.
Both Tim Burton and Danny Elfman both consider this like their most personal and favorite work, so I really appreciate that. And then personal reviews, because I don't think you watched this with anyone and Jess didn't watch this with me this time.
Oh, okay. So we were both partnerless on this
Yes.
time. Yeah, I watched this alone. I actually watched this yesterday when I had a window of time. I liked it. I'd give it like 7.5 or an 8 out of 10.
Yep. And
I'd say it's a cut above most movies.
I would say the same. I actually would give it pretty much the exact same rating. That doesn't mean that... I think that for me, I kind of separate like the objective rating from like my personal rating. Like I can love a movie that's like a 5 out of 10. I can love a movie that's a 5 out of 10.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Like some movies are just made to a higher degree, a pedigree than other movies, and it doesn't necessarily make them less enjoyable. So I like this movie actually a lot more than I was even expecting to, because
That's good.
I had seen this multiple times as a kid, and like I said, things have stuck with me from this movie. Like even the score, I was kind of like listening to the movie like again this time. I was like, oh yeah, I remember this. Like I remember being a kid and just like how great this score was back then, just how magical it is. But I think a lot of this likely went over my head when I saw it, right?
There's a lot of properties that are kind of about or sold on teen angst, and it's kind of, you get a different perspective, you know, looking at it when you're an adult, right?
Yeah.
Like The Catcher in the Rye, for instance. I reread it last year, but I read it for the first time when I was 23 or 24, and I was kind of like, wow, okay, like, you know, you get a different perspective because you're out of adolescence.
Right.
At least physically at that point.
I read that book when I was like 15 and I hated it. I thought it was the worst book I'd ever read.
You'd probably appreciate it more now as an adult.
Yeah.
Because you'd have more empathy for the character.
Yeah, I
Because
probably
he's just
would.
like a brat kid who's being neglected by his parents and probably should be on all of the drugs.
Yeah.
I'm being sarcastic.
So yeah, I think that this is a movie that you have to wait until you're a little bit older to fully get. And I think that's, again, this is the millennial experience, right? Of like the older millennials would have got this movie at the right time, and subsequently in the 90s rewatching this would have been like, it would have hit so close to home. But us being the baby millennials, we just kind of missed this one.
We are kind of the baby millennials, aren't we?
Yeah.
Like we're almost Zoomers, but we're not.
Yes.
And we're very proud of that.
Correct.
We
Yes.
high five each other all the time. It's so weird being at this age because like you have, you know, I'm teaching at a college and I'm actually like, I'm not that much older than my students, but
Right.
I feel there's a huge gulf of information between us
Yeah.
just because of the time periods we were born in.
Yeah, definitely. I like this movie a lot. I don't think that this is my favorite Tim Burton movie, and that goes to Big Fish, I'm pretty sure.
I've never seen it.
Oh, it's so good. It's like a perfect Sunday afternoon movie.
I really want to see Ed Wood.
Yeah, we've talked about doing that. We haven't quite gotten to it yet, but we'll definitely do more Tim Burton movies in the future. I really like to, after watching this, I really want to go back and watch his Batman movies because I haven't seen those since I was probably under 10 as well.
Da-na-na-na-na, da-na-na-na, da-na-na-na. No, that's a score by Danny Elfman. Anyways,
I haven't seen Mars Attacks since I was probably like 13 years old.
I think I saw it on TV when I was like
Yes.
11, and
Yeah.
I was just like, wow.
I think I haven't seen it in full either. Like I've seen parts of it here and there.
Yeah, by the way, to the young people watching this, back in the day, you just watched movies on TV, and you would sometimes pop in at a weird moment
And
then
pop out.
Yeah, and then pop out, right?
So this is like a story of that. Like I have never seen Forrest Gump from start to finish, but I've seen the entire movie.
I've never seen it. Period.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Yeah. Like
Maybe
I haven't.
we do that next
I haven't
year.
seen a single frame of Forrest Gump.
That's wild. I have an idea for next year.
What's your idea, Blake?
No spoilers. No
No
spoilers.
spoilers.
No
All right.
spoilers.
No spoilers. All right. Well,
But yeah, I kind of want to go back to those. You already went back to Beetlejuice, but I want to go back to Beetlejuice as well because I don't have fond memories of that. I always rubbed really hard against that movie.
it's
as a kid.
It's not for me. It's not bad. It's just not for me.
Yeah, that's kind of the same way that I felt too. Like I think that it just I felt a little alienated by it. Like, I was like, oh, this is just really not a movie for me.
This is just weird. Yeah.
So I'd like to rewatch it though and see if it's still. I think I'll objectively like appreciate it, but it won't be something that I'll ever need to see again after I watch it one more time.
You know what's funny is that Michael Keaton apparently considers that his best performance.
Yeah.
And I want to just be like, Michael, Michael. You were better in the other guys. You've done way better performances. Come on. I did love that meme though, where they're just like Beetlejuice is like, when Pete Davidson dies, he will become Beetlejuice.
That's a great point. I've never seen that meme, but that's hilarious.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, I've never really been interested in like Tim Burton's later works. Like I'm pretty sure I've seen both Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I'm pretty sure I've seen both Alice in Wonderland. But
I'm so sorry.
I've repressed those memories very deep down.
You know what's funny is that even as like a shitty 16 or 17-year-old, I saw trailers for Alice in Wonderland and I was like, that looks terrible. I'm not watching that.
I think I had the same thing. It was probably like I was forced upon me, like my sister wanted to watch it or like a friend wanted to watch it, and I was like, whatever.
Fucking Laura, making you watch Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey Laura, if you're listening, you suck.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like I'm actually a big fan. Like as a kid, I really loved the original Alice in Wonderland.
I actually just watched the original, the Disney one this year.
I've been meaning to get back to it so badly.
I was quite charmed by it.
I imagine I will be as well. Like that's the one Disney movie that I've been kind of circling the drain on of like, when am I going to fit this in? So hopefully soon.
Well, the holidays are coming up, Blake.
Yeah, but I've already got movie plans.
You and your plans.
Me and my plans. And my plans are 3 extended versions of The Lord of the Rings, which are sitting right behind you. So.
Oh shit. Well, hey, the holidays are coming up for me too. I could join you for those.
Cool.
I've only seen the Lord of the Rings movies once.
Oh my god!
And
what's wrong with you?
Lots of things, Blake. And it's been like 15 years.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I'm due for a rewatch.
I don't know. That's all my thoughts on Edward Scissorhands and Tom Burton.
Tom Burton. That's up there with Kung Fu Amanda. Jesus fucking Christ. How do we have a podcast?
The Hall of Fame. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Next episode is our best of. We're going to do our best of old movies, and we're going to do our best of movies from the last 5 years, first or second viewing.
Right. So it's going to be 2 top 5s.
Yep.
From your 2 favorite podcast hosts.
Yep.
And yeah, it should be a fun time.
I'm really excited about it. This is one of my favorite episodes the whole year, is talking about my favorite movies.
Yeah, I'm going to have to do a little bit of digging to see what I enjoyed the most, but I have some surprise contenders on the list.
Cool. I'm genuinely really excited for it. It's always one of my favorite episodes. So
yeah.
Otherwise, I guess at this point, like, let us know what your thoughts are on Edward Scissorhands. Like, is this a movie that you really connect with? Also, tell us about your favorite movies that you've watched this year. Love to hear about that.
Maybe we'll slip them in and they'll make it onto the list.
Yeah, because maybe there's a movie I haven't seen yet and you'd really recommend to me just based on what you've heard that I really like on this podcast to this point, and if I can fit it in and maybe it gets on the list, you know?
I like to think that like there are people listening who are like trying desperately to cobble together our weird taste in movies, right?
At some point, we will do our top 100.
Oh, man. I'm going to need advanced warning on that one.
That's going to be like a 6-part episode or something like that, where each episode we do like 10 movies.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be fun, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the plan. That's the plan, anyway.
Subscribe to our Patreon and we'll do that sooner.
We don't have a Patreon because we don't have viewers.
No, we sure don't.
And we don't have viewers because we don't do video.
We're getting there. Are we? I don't know.
Anyway, we'll see you next time.
Tell your sister and Edward Scissorhands, it's been a slice.